What's up, guys? It's Bromley. Welcome back. Today we're going to go over the squat checklist. This is an extension of a piece that I did a couple months ago. I did the bench press checklist where we just kind of went over all of the components you need if you want to take that lift seriously and improve it long term. It was pretty popular and got some good feedback, so I figured I would do it for some of the other lifts as well. So today we're going to attack the barbell squat, which is king of the lifts. Now, real quick, base strength is down to $9.99. That is the reduced price. You can get it at EmpireBarbellStore.com or the Amazon Kindle store. I have a couple of new projects I'm working on. Those should be out within the month, so stay tuned for those. Also, the Patreon is killing it right now. If you want your questions turned into a full YouTube video, that's where I'm going to take those questions from. So go ahead and sign up. We have a $5 and $10 tier, and that support is 100% what allows me to keep putting out content. So thank you, everybody, for that. So getting into the squat checklist, we're going to cover the big areas we need as far as structuring a program, movement selection, the things you need to pay attention to keep your squat moving indefinitely. And hopefully I have some tips and tricks for some of you guys that might have this as a sticky lift that's kind of resistant to growth. So I'll cover that a little bit as well. So starting out, it's important to know what your technique is, and a lot of that's going to have to do with your build. Now, I can only talk about it so much. Each one of these points can be its own video, probably its own book, but we're going to hit the big notes. So with technique, there is broadly two different techniques to squatting that you tend to see over and over. There's a more narrow stance squat, which tends to be more associated with lower depth, getting ass to grass with a higher bar position, although sometimes you see different components shared between the two setups. The other technique on the other end of the spectrum tends to be wider stance. Typically, for most people's hips, it makes it harder to get depth. So those tend to be more slow, controlled parallel squats. You tend to see the barbell a little lower on the shoulders because that optimizes leverage a little bit. And all of these have implications for what type of tempo you're going to see. You tend to see a faster drop and a harder bounce on high bar squat, although some powerlifters have gotten really good at controlling the tension into a narrow squat. So that is really an individual thing. You're going to see that vary a little bit, but for the most part, if you're going to bounce and you're going to get depth, and that's how you're going to generate power, see that compression and speed, you're looking narrow. If you're a little bit more controlled, like that kind of elevator forklift motion coming down slow, and then reversing direction, usually that's associated with the wider stance low bar squat. Now, the build you tend to see with people, this tends to be associated with longer femurs. You'll see guys with shorter boxy torsos, longer femurs. If squatting down is kind of awkward and cumbersome, usually those guys will make it a little more friendly just by taking their base out a little wider. Bending over a little bit more, that's going to be a little bit more posterior dominant, whereas you're going to see this a bit more from guys who are built like me, longer torso relative to their height, shorter legs. That makes it really easy to drop down and pop back up because there's not a lot of front to back motion from the tiny hobbit femurs that we have. Now, that's very general. There's plenty of Olympic weightlifters who have long legs, who have developed the mobility to get down into that position. Hip shape can also play a factor. There's a lot of things that go into it. But the reason we need to know how we are starting out with our technique is because that has implications for how we are going to develop from the squat, how it's going to build us, and what movements we're going to need to do to round that out. Again, wide stance, low bar, bending over a bit more glutes, more hamstrings, upper back has to be stronger to support that bar as you pitch forward and then stand up. High bar, you're talking more quad dominant. Now, high bar squatters tend to have problems with their hamstrings because you're not hinging, you're not pitching over at all. The hamstrings don't load the same way. So glutes and quads tend to get very strong. Hamstrings tend to be a weakness. Also, you don't need quite as much upper back or midsection strength to deal with that. So that's important to know. This is typically associated with a more like athletic style squat. Speed tends to be a bigger component. The extra range of motion and mobility required to do it tends to correlate a little bit to other sports and other activities. I actually like that style of squatting because it helps a lot with things like side handle picks. It helps with cleans, with loading. Every time I have to set something in my lap, squat down, grab it, and stand up, I find that narrow stance, more upright type squatting is a really big asset. Tire flips. So most strongman events, I think, benefit from that. Now, wider stance, it gets your hips nasty strong. So it tends to have better deadlift carryover. It tends to be better for general power output. So there's give and take. If you're a powerlifter, you want to pick one that you're confident you can build into a competitive setup, where you're confident that you're comfortable enough with it that you can handle the most amount of weight, and then you're going to condition yourself around that. If there's other reasons you're developing a squat for sports, for aesthetics, then you're going to look at which muscles are dominant and you're going to put yourself in a position accordingly. So keep that in mind. Now, getting into the main movement, so we have these different methods of choosing what your main squat exercise is. Whatever aesthetic goals you have, even if it's a sport goal like powerlifting, you want to have what your main go-to lift is. The squat by itself is a fantastic developmental exercise, just a good old-fashioned put the bar on your shoulders, sit down, stand up, free squat. But we already covered some of the differences in technique, going parallel or ass to grass, narrow or wide, and a lot of people like to supplement box squatting. Westside made that very popular, and even in athletics for sports, I know a lot of strongmen that do it. They will have the box there because it's good for building rate of force development, and they tend to think it's easier to recover from because you're deloading completely at the bottom instead of loading the joints into that bounce action. So that's something to consider. Now, as far as your main movement, if you work out at a Planet Fitness and all you have is a Smith machine squat is perfectly fine for getting your legs, your lower half bigger and stronger over time. If all you do is box squat, if your box squat progresses, you will get bigger and stronger over time. So while I am partial to just a good old-fashioned free squat, I think that is probably, for most people, the best way to check all boxes, to get good development, keep good mobility, build coordination, build speed, resilience, grow muscle, grow strength. I think that tends to be the most well-rounded version of the lift. By no means do you have to pigeonhole yourself there. All of these variations can be treated as a main lift, so to speak. And if it progresses over time, that weight goes up, that's going to mean you got bigger and stronger. So don't stress out about it too much. You got to commit to one. You got to pick what your path is going to be, and you have to work around it. You have to build and make decisions around that decision. So main lift, you're going to pick one. Let's assume for most of you it's just a regular free squat, and you're going to pick a stance and depth that suits your build that you feel comfortable with. So the variations are going to be movements, adjustments you make to the movement that ideally keep you well-rounded. So this is going to prevent overuse issues, which even if you feel good now, just know that lifting is degenerative. Over time, it's likely that you will get some overuse issue. The more well-rounded you are, the less likely that is to happen. If all you do is squat, 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 you're going to develop in a very specific way, and it's likely that some underdeveloped structure is going to lead to an imbalance, and that's going to result in some issues, so you want to avoid that. Also, as far as weaknesses, you want to be as well-rounded as possible, so you limit the occurrence of weaknesses. You're only as strong as your weakest link. If you only do one movement that develops you in a certain way, there's money you're leaving on the table, so to speak, by not bringing up weaker areas that might get exposed with maximal weights, so keep that in mind. Now, there's two ways to approach this. I prefer the method that keeps variations in rotation just to keep you well-rounded. It's variation for the sake of it. The other approach is to be a little bit more aggressive with which variation to use, as if you're trying to intentionally attack weaknesses. I don't tend to focus on that as much because I find that if your exercise selection is good, if there's a good amount of variation, and you adhere to your method of progressive overload, everything tends to go up. No matter how strong you get, you will always have a weakness. There's no way to truly eliminate that. And a lot of times fixating on the movement selection doesn't work out the way you think it should. So there's a lot of potential pitfalls with leaning too heavily on what your exercise selection is, as opposed to just picking a few good movements and progressing forward. I think that's easier. I think it tends to be a little more foolproof, and it's friendlier for most people. So I like to just keep a certain amount of rotation in. Now, depending on which phase I'm in, if I'm base building, I'm going to do things that are more disadvantage. I like to separate these variations by whether they're disadvantage or advantage. Really, all you have to ask yourself is, how much more or less weight does this variation allow me to use? If I can squat 500 pounds, but let's say a 3-second eccentric tempo squat with a pause at the bottom only allows me to squat 440, that is a disadvantaged movement. If I'm used to squatting wide to parallel and I do a narrow stance ass to grass squat, that's going to cut the amount of weight that I'm using. There's more range of motion, and it's a style I'm not used to. So those are disadvantage movements. Advantage movements allow for overload. So it might be a pin squat or a box squat that's a little above parallel. It might be a bar, maybe a cambered bar allows you to pull the weight back into your hips, and that allows you to use a little more weight. So overloaded methods are better for getting your nervous system dialed in, handling maximal loads, and that's good for peaking as you start to get stronger towards the end and more of your work is in a very strength-specific range. Disadvantaged movements are better for building mass. You're usually talking more range of motion, more time under tension, and you're talking about movements that are going to hit areas you don't hit with just your main movement, and that is going to build out as wide of a base as possible. So I think of disadvantage movements happening early on with more volume, advantage movements happening later on. So the variations you can do: stance, wide versus narrow. We know wide versus narrow hits your hips and quads differently, but it's also what you're used to. You might think of one, let's say a wide stance squat, as being stronger, mechanically more advantage, but if you're only used to squatting narrow, wide stance is going to be very weak. So throwing in movements that are kind of alternatives to the way that you're used to training is a good way, especially in off-season or in base building phases, to just have enough variation that keeps you well-rounded. You can adjust bar position, high to low, or change to specialty bars. So a safety bar hits your upper back more, shifts the weight in front. A front squat shifts the weight in front. These different bars and different bar positions can greatly affect how the weight is felt and which structures have to compensate to move the weight. Range of motion is a big one. Again, more range of motion, going deeper, or again, more time under tension with a longer tempo. That is going to be a disadvantage movement. Accommodating resistance, that's one. I count that as an advantage movement, even though you might feel that for the same straight weight, you can't perform as well because the bands are limiting you. What accommodating resistance does is it smooths out your strength curve. If you go all the way down in a squat and come all the way up, and let's say the most you can do is 500 pounds, that's because it's somewhere along the line, your weakest link in the movement, that's where you can only handle 500 pounds. That might be at the bottom of the squat. At the top, you might be able to handle 700 pounds. So the curve is dictated by where your weakest link is. So by adding weight, adding tension as you get into stronger and stronger mechanical positions, more of the movement is going to experience maximal strain or substantial strain. So accommodating resistance helps with that. So because it has that effect on your strength curve, it's something that allows more force production in a single rep than you would otherwise be able to do a straight weight, and that represents a huge stress. So we usually associate that with maximal work, it works the top end, right? So you get more top end stimulus where you're stronger than you otherwise would, or with speed work where you're practicing really hammering in, accelerating through the entire rep. So you learn how to hit the gas and keep on hitting the gas. So I count accommodating resistance as something you do when you're closer to a position where you're going to be using maximal load. It's great for your nervous system. It's great to get your body to condition to that impulse of pushing and continuing to push as that weight gets heavier and heavier towards the top. So you're going to sprinkle these in based on what your needs are, based on which phase you're in. I would stick to one, maybe two variations of the squat. I wouldn't go crazy with variations because the effect gets watered down. So pick what you want to work on, what you think is appropriate, and again, commit to it. The accessory and isolation work, this is going to lean heavily on your preferred method of training. If you're, let's say, a bodybuilder type, or you're a bunny where you just like going to the gym and just going, and you do every exercise under the sun, this method of training that follows up with a lot of isolation and a lot of machine or body weight accessory work, it's very viable. It works very well. There have been plenty of bodybuilders that have used it, plenty of good athletes that have used a lot of different exercises to keep themselves well-rounded. However, if you only do a leg extension twice a month and you don't really take it seriously, it's a waste of time, especially when compared to what your normal squat volume is going to be like. So this is only something that is really useful if you take it seriously, and I have a hell of a hard time getting people who are used to just barbell stuff taking the smaller lifts seriously. But they can go a long way into isolating specific weaknesses. For instance, let's say your hamstrings are weak, something we know can happen with a high bar squat because the hamstrings don't load up that much compared to, let's say, the quads or glutes. If that's the case, there are a few things that are going to hit your hamstrings as well as a simple hamstring curl. Laying down, doing a few sets of 10 every week, adding another set or two, adding a little more weight. If you do that for 6 weeks, your hamstrings are going to grow. There's no way around it. So these can be very useful tools. The quads, leg extensions, leg press, drags are some of my favorite. You want to get really crazy, just get some blood in your quads, maybe help with some knee tendonitis. You can tie the voodoo floss bands or some type of latex band around your legs. Do a few rounds of backward sled dragging. Your quads will blow up. Your knees will feel great. And it doesn't have an eccentric component. So they're good for GPP. They're very easy to recover from. And that extra volume is going to help your quads grow. Quads are essential. They are essential. They're huge for squatting. I don't care what anybody else says. The knee is extending under a load. The quads do that. They do that all day. There's even studies to show that the quads actually aid in hip extension by strapping up because it crosses two joints, that it works in concert with the hip extensors and actually aids in hip extension. So that's something to keep in mind. So you guys, they have the long legs that do the wider stance squatting. You might say, hey, I could squat 600 pounds, but I have chicken legs. What's up with that? You can easily add in extra volume with isolation work. For glutes, if you're the guy that doesn't have good glute development, then something's happening where they're not getting activated, they're not being used to their potential. Squatting is a very ass-heavy movement, so if you're squatting substantial poundages, your ass should be growing. You should be getting sore from hard workouts. There's a lot of hip extension. There's no reason it wouldn't be getting hit. So activation exercises, if your glutes are getting bypassed by, say, your hamstrings and your erectors, activation exercises, that's pushing your knees out to the side, that's trying to twist your feet down into the ground, that's trying to get that abduction to occur where the knees are coming out, and that part of the glute med does that. And you want to feel that tension build up, so as you come down into the hole, you feel the glutes get tight, and you feel how they contribute to that pop at the top. If you don't have a sense of that, if you clench and then the second you start to descend, you feel them go loose, you've got work to do. So hip circle stuff, clamshells, fire hydrant stuff, glute kickbacks, bridges are good, single leg bridges where you have one leg up in the air and you're using the other leg to push your hip up with your shoulders on a bench. That's great. Lunges, I've never met anybody that did lunges. I like them alternating, step forward and push back, then step forward and push back. That hits the glutes hard, and it's a good dynamic exercise to build explosiveness. So if you're a normal squatter and your glutes are doing what they're supposed to and you're growing from the belly button down from all the squatting volume you're doing, probably don't need a lot of glute work because the glutes do get hit. If you're one of these guys where they're not getting hit, then you got to look to something else. Hamstrings, back extensions, curls, GHRs, whatever deadlift and deadlift accessory you're doing should be taking care of that. But if you're, let's say, a CrossFitter, Olympic lifter, a very high bar squatter for whatever reason, and you're lacking in hamstring development, then these simple exercises do the trick. Any type of isolated hip extension, Romanian deadlifts, dumbbell Romanian deadlifts, again, weighted back extensions, GHRs, hamstring curls are some of my favorite. There's not a lot better for your hammies than just a really hard round of hammy curls. And then calves, back, midsection, those are all very relevant. Calves, believe it or not, contribute a lot to squatting. Helps with ankle stability, helps with knee compression as your knee compresses at the bottom as that joint closes. The thickness of the calf, the strength of the calf helps with that stabilization as you rebound back up. So calf work is sometimes warranted. Upper back and midsection, more so for you bent over squatters, for you guys that like to lean way over, whether you have long legs or that's just your preferred method. For those that stay upright, that's a very advantaged position. The upper back typically doesn't have to do much, but if you're doing a lot of front-loaded stuff, front squats, safety bar squats, that's probably one of the better ways to hit that. And you should be doing some upper back isolation anyways. Squatting over time, deadlifting over time, that should take care of most of your growth, but there are some exercises to help with that. But that's as needed, aside from whatever generic variations you do with those exercises. You don't need to hyper fixate on it unless it really exposes itself as a main weakness. So that covers the meat and potatoes of exercise selection, of the technique, of all of the ways you're going to approach your squat from that standpoint. And then that takes us over to the programming component, how you are going to arrange this in a week and how you are going to plan to move forward. Exercise selection is a lot of it. Picking good exercises and training them consistently, that will take you very far, but you have to know how to control for stress and recovery. You have to know how to dose stress, when to move forward, when to push back. You should be able to look at a split and know exactly week to week what is changing and how that change is going to cause you to grow. So you need to know the split, the weekly schedule. That's the first thing. There's a few different options. Let's start with the obvious one. Very high frequency squatting, not a fan. It's not that it doesn't work or it can't work. It's just that it represents more pitfalls for most of you. I don't know very many really, really good squatters, and I know a lot of 800 plus pound squatters. I don't know anybody that trains 4 times a week or more. Everybody's heard of things like Smolov. Everybody's heard of some Soviet lifter that probably trains in an Olympic lifting style where they do a lot of frequency and they just adjust the amount of work and how it's distributed. There's not a lot though. You have to search to find them. There's more chances to screw that up. If you are going to do it, you should be working with somebody who has a ton of experience and knows exactly how it's going to help you. It's also very specific, which I don't like, because most of you want to benefit from all of the things that squatting does in the way it helps other things. So in the way that it helps your deadlift or helps strongman events or helps whatever athletic endeavor you do, the more time you spend squatting out of the week, that's less time you have to recover to for other exercises. So keep that in mind. 1, 2, 3 times a week, and I'm going to go over the easiest and the most popular ways of approaching those. So 1 time per week, that's high volume, high effort. That's power building, bodybuilding. That's doing everything at once. Your heavy made work, your lighter or volume variations, your higher rep isolation work. You're going scorched earth. You're getting it done in one workout, and then you're resting a week. Now, more advanced lifters might alternate. They might go a heavy workout 1 week and then a lighter one the next, and they might bounce back and forth. But one time squatting per week is going to represent a lot of work in one workout. Now, if you like doing a lot of work, if you're a sadist, that might be the path. If you have a hard time lasting through a long workout like that, or you find it that soreness you get from that one all-out workout, or the lack of recovery makes it hard to do other things you need to throughout the week, you might want to split up the weekly volume in other workouts. So it allows you to do more, but you're never too thrashed from one workout. So go into twice a week. Now, assuming you're not doing a linear progression, which just means you're adding 5 pounds every time. Grayscale LP is a good example. You squat twice per week, but every workout's the same. It's just 5 pounds more, 5 pounds more, on and on. The next level of complexity that most of you are going to want to look at is something like a heavy light split, or a split where you're doing one workout as a main lift, another as a variation. That's an option. Heavy light, that means you have your heavy workout or your substantial workout that progresses in some linear fashion each week. Your lighter workout is just arbitrarily lighter. It's a recovery workout. So you get more practice, you get a little more touches, more total weekly volume, and you're not going to be quite as beat up on any one day. But it's that substantial workout. They progress together week to week, and that's what drives progress forward. Main and variation, you can play with which thresholds you work on each day. They might both be very hard or substantial workouts, but your main lift might be just your regular squatting. Variation might be an alternative. If your main lift is narrow, you might go wide, or vice versa, or it might be a day where you box squat. Think about West Side. You have max effort and dynamic effort days. So you have your heavy day, and then another day it's like speed work, banded work. There's a lot of options there, and you can arrange it based on perceived weaknesses. You can do it based on volume versus intensity. You can do it based on if you have kind of more of a deadlift day and more of a squat day, hip, knee, hinge squat. You might do, let's say, a box squat, which is a little more hingy and carries over to a deadlift on one day. You might do more of an upright, more narrow stance squat another day. A lot of options. 3 times a week. Now, these are the most common ways of doing it. Again, I'm not going to get into like a Shako type approach or something where we're just distributing the workload in different ways. These are more kind of westernized progressions that are very easy to follow, and I'm here to make it simple for you. That's what I'm trying to do. 3 times a week, you have heavy, light, medium, and daily undulating periodization. Now, that just represents different thresholds on each day. Now, the main difference is DUP. It's all the stuff you would do in a normal periodized 12, 16, 20 week cycle, where it's volume into strength into power, maximal strength, or what have you, and you're just doing it concurrently. So each day of DUP represents some, there's a hypertrophy or a volume day, there's an intensity day, there's power or recovery day, something like that. HLM is just arbitrarily heavier or lighter. So Texas Method is kind of a good example. Heavy, light, medium, Andy Baker does a lot of stuff on that. But you might have a heavy squat day, which is a hard 3x5 or 4x5. You might have a light day, which is recovery, 20% lighter. The medium day might be some fewer sets, and it might be 5 or 10% lighter. So threshold is the same, rep range is the same or similar. The effort you're putting out changes, and that's what allows you to get a lot of frequency in, a lot of practice in, with plenty of recovery. So that kind of undulation of effort throughout the week allows you to keep growing. These are all Bromley approved. I like all these methods. They're easy for anybody to run. It's just a matter of what you think you can recover from. The more other activities you have to do, the harder it is to run high frequency, or the harder it is to do a lot of effort on a regular basis. So just keep that in mind with what your other goals are. Are you trying to deadlift at the same time? Are you trying to prepare for another sport? Are you doing strongman events? You're not going to be able to squat 3 times a week if you're running strongman events throughout the week. I'm going to tell you that right now. So keep that in mind. Now, once you have your frequency, you're going to go into the threshold and progression. Now, this is where base peak comes in, my method of parsing out variation over time. We have base building on one side, kind of chasing your peak on the other side. You widen your base with variation and hypertrophy and rounding yourself out. And then as that raises your potential peak, then you start chasing that peak by doing more specific, heavier work. So that's kind of periodization simplified. That's how I like to approach it. So in a more base-oriented phase, you might do a threshold that's higher rep, lower percentage. You're going to be getting a lot more work, a lot more practice. Whereas a peak phase or a phase that's more specific, you're going to be doing a lot more heavy, higher percentage work, or at least a lot more effort, a lot more singular, all-out efforts. When I'm getting ready for strongman, my peak is AMRAPs, because it's not that I need a maximal PR, it's that I need my conditioning good. So I use effort as to kind of substitute that maximal threshold. So the progression, you have options between linear progressions, which I like, I'm a fan of. You just have to expand on the typical starting strength simple type LPs, because those get outgrown very quickly when you go from novice to getting any amount of strength. So you do that by spreading efforts further apart. An example of that is going heavy light or HLM, where you're just going weekly instead of a few times the same week. You can go something like 5-3-1. That's an example of an LP. It's just a 3-week wave. That's a good example. Periodization, we talked about that. Now the thing about periodization, you're talking about starting high volume and then moving to high intensity over time as the volume drops. Now the thing to understand is that periodization works not just because of the way it moves in one 10-week cycle or 12-week cycle, but because of what happens on that first workout. If you're starting with the high volume workout, you have to think about what you were doing before. Everything you do works the way it does because of what you were doing before. So that's very important. If you're starting high volume, you are probably finishing up with a contest peak, which means your fitness is down, your capacity is down, but your strength is very, very up. So when you're starting in, whatever that first workout is, 5 sets of 10, that's exposing you to a new stimulus. Your volume went from 0 to 100 like that. So that's something you want to think about when you're looking at these phases. That volume phase works because you're sensitive to it, because you haven't been doing it. So going into volume increase is a method of progression. I like to take time building into the volume phase. It doesn't make sense to start with the most amount of volume on workout 1 and then intensify all the way down. It makes more sense to adapt to the volume. Get your capacity up. Get your rep endurance up a little bit. Get your psychology oriented towards those high volume workouts, and then start to push the weight, and you'll get more out of it. So I like to step load or volumize. Volumizing is my favorite. You pick a weight, a rep range, and you just add sets, and you build up over a couple weeks, and then you drop back down a little heavier, and then repeat a couple waves of that, and then you're ready to start handling weights and intensifying. So there's a lot of options for progressions. Base strength has a lot of them. You can find a lot on the internet, but make sure that make sure that your method of progression is obvious, so you're never at a loss for what you're going to do the next workout, why it's going to make you grow. You always know where you're at in your training. That's the only way you can make good decisions. And lastly, we finish with what your deadline is. That's just the time frame you're training for before you're due for your next big change. I'm a big fan of waves. I like 3-week waves because it takes care of a short to medium term structure where you know it's a sustainable amount of recovery. 5-3-1 is a good example. There's a lot of examples of these, but it's like 85, 90, 95%, then you reset 5 pounds heavier. So every 3 weeks, it's shifting up that way. And the waves, the changing in percentages, the changing in volume over a wave, it has a recovery built in. So it kind of eliminates the need for a deload unless you're really, really pushing the waves. That undulation of volume and intensity has recovery built into it, which is really nice. And then I can decide, is 3 weeks enough? Do I feel good? Do I feel like I'm ready to transition to something heavier or more specific? Maybe I can run it for 12 weeks and I can just milk it for all it's worth. There's a lot of options there. You can play it by ear. Another option is to go 3 to 5 week blocks, a la block periodization, 3 to 5 weeks in a certain percentage range. You can do that applying an LP. You can do that applying volume. If you're trying to increase volume, you stay in that percentage range, and then once you get out of it, you either deload and then keep going, or you make a quantum leap. If you've been up to 75%, then now your quantum leap is 3 to 5 weeks at 80 to 85%. And that's how that works. As long as you have some method of overload where week to week how those workouts are increasing. Indefinitely. Some of you just like adding weight, keeping your fingers crossed, going until the wheels fall off. A long LP might be ran for months if you're new. You might progress to more advanced linear progressions. Again, 5-3-1 is probably the king of advanced linear progressions, which I'm a fan of because it's simple enough that novices can still respond to it. Novices don't need to squat 3 times a week to grow. Novice can still respond to 5-3-1, but it has enough space in between hard efforts, and the wave function allows more intermediate lifters to really benefit from it. So there's that as well. So there's a lot of options. Now, the point is understanding that a lot of these decisions are going to be vital. Some of these are going to be things you have to know. You have to know your technique, you have to know your goals, you have to know which variations are best suited for what you're going to do and what you're likely to actually stick to. Don't try to do something you're likely to do a week and say screw this and then ditch it. So all of those things are very important, but a lot of decisions honestly are arbitrary. It's important to know the difference. At some point you just have to pick something. Instead of quibbling over whether you think a tricep extension or a skull crusher is better, just picking some mode, some movement, and committing to getting it better is going to have the end result of leaving you with a bigger, stronger tricep. Same is true for all of these. Commit to a mode of training. Make it your mission to find a sustainable workload that you enjoy doing, that you're committed to, that suits your needs, and then progress off of that. That's really all there is to it. If you're checking these boxes, if you're paying attention to your setup, if you're understanding what your goals are and how your main movement's going to recognize that, how you're going to prop that up with specific movements at different phases of your training, how you're going to range that training, how hard and how often you're going to progress that effort, and for how long, that's about it. If you've got a way to take all of this and put it together in a comprehensive fashion, you have got that killer squat routine that is going to get you the goals you want. As long as you're being smart, you're not putting the cart before the horse, you're letting yourself flesh out that training cycle, and you're not trying to overdo it. Every few months, you should be seeing even steady PRs. And if you put yourself ahead 12, 16, 24 months, you should find yourself much stronger than when you started. It's not that hard. It's really just about committing to the end goal. All of these questions will answer themselves as you put yourself out there more and more. So get committed, write a plan, stick to it, take notes. You guys will get there. Thanks so much, guys. I'm sure there's going to be a ton of questions here. So go ahead and leave them in the comment box. If you want a more guaranteed or more thorough response, that will probably be on the Patreon page. So go ahead and check that out as well. Appreciate it, guys. Again, you've been awesome. Thanks for all your support. I will talk to you guys next time. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.